Okay, for more on the impact of inflation on the global economy, Rajiv Biswas joins us live from Singapore via Skype. He is the Executive Director and Chief Economist for Asia Pacific region at IHS Markit. Rajiv, thanks very much for taking time to chat with us. I want to start by looking at the big picture. Almost every corner of the world right now is coping with inflation. What does this mean for the global economy, and is there some hope that this won't be a long-term problem that really comes home to roost?
I think inflation has proven to be much more persistent and protracted than had been expected in the early part of 2021. So expectations are now that inflationary pressures globally will be more protracted and will continue through 2022. And the reason for that is partly energy prices have been surging. We've seen world oil prices rising pretty sharply in recent months. And also there's been persistent global supply chain disruptions due to the pandemic throughout 2021. And these are continuing in 2022 with no early end in sight. And of course, we've had the Omicron waves hitting many countries in recent months, and that's also continuing to add to problems with labor shortages evident in many countries now because of the high cases of Omicron reported. So there's a number of factors that are coming together to create this persistent high inflation, and that will continue through this year. And of course, central banks are now starting to react to that as well.
Let me ask you about supply chain, because you touched on that. In this global economy, international brands, car makers, and those companies are really a wealth of nations now. How are they holding and coping up?
Well, actually, car makers have been particularly badly affected by the supply chain disruptions because cars are increasingly reliant on thousands of semiconductor chips that are going into every vehicle as they become more sophisticated. And the world has really suffered from a massive disruption in production of sufficient chips. So in 2021, the chip shortages increased globally, and the delivery times are now so long that it's really affected auto production worldwide.
You know, I'm sure that people are frustrated on every continent, and here in the United States, President Joe Biden said he believes that inflation is going to let up by the end of the year. But you talked about it being a persistent problem. Do you think that Biden is being overly glowing at this point?
I think what we're seeing is that the supply chain pressures are starting to ease, but they're still very high. So from the point of view of supply chain disruptions, that may gradually improve through the course of 2022. But the problem facing the US and also some other countries, particularly in Europe, is that there's now increasing wage pressures. And we're seeing that in average hourly earnings in the US economic data. And that's now gone up to much higher rate than several years ago. So once you get wage pressures adding to the overall inflationary pressures, it does mean that inflation becomes more persistent. So I think the challenge of inflation is becoming more protracted in 2022 and beyond because of wage pressures and a tight labor market.
Rajiv, we're kind of tight on time, but China has been bucking the trend, but clearly they are concerned about the drag that inflation could have on its economy. Why has China been bucking that trend, and how do you see Asia emerging from this inflation crisis?
I think what we've seen in China is that the supply chain disruptions have been much less because China has largely managed to keep the pandemic under control. And so during 2021, factories were operating pretty much normally, and therefore some of these issues of supply chain disruptions that we're seeing in the US and other parts of the world haven't been so evident in China. And that's why CPI inflation in China is more moderate right now, and the outlook for inflation for 2022 in China is also for moderate inflation to continue. So in China, the problems are much less on the inflation front than in the US or Europe. So I think when we look at the overall picture in Asia, uh, it is a mixed picture because some countries have suffered big disruptions due to the pandemic.
Right.
We saw back in the third quarter of last year a lot of disruption in Southeast Asia and manufacturing production. And of course, Omicron waves have been hitting also some countries like Japan and South Korea in the early part of 2022. But I think as we progress through 2022, these supply chain disruptions should ease in Asia. And the wage pressures are generally less than what's being seen in the US.
Okay.